Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. James Lyons-Weiler coming to you live from the WWDNYK studios in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There are very many people that have a lot of questions about, not only about vaccines, about COVID-19 vaccines in particular, but also about their own personal experience with COVID-19 vaccines, the regulatory science around it, guidances and positions, published positions on the near universal efficacy and safety. These are important questions. And recently, there was a letter that was sent by a doctor to the FDA that made a point about potential risks that he perceived that they should probably think about when they're making recommendations on who should and should not get the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines, or I suppose any vaccines, but COVID-19 vaccines, but we'll talk with him about that. It's not unrelated to pathogenic priming. So obviously, if you've read my study from April on pathogenic priming, it's not unrelated to concerns over antibody-dependent enhancement, but it's a different mechanism by which a person, he's proposed a different mechanism by which a person who previously has had a COVID-19 vaccine may actually not be an ideal candidate for COVID-19 vaccines. And so I'd like you to help me welcome Dr. Hooman Noorchashm. How are you today, sir?
Hi, James. How are you? Thanks for the invitation to come on your show and discuss this potential issue.
I am so grateful for you taking the time out. You've got a stellar background here. You have your education at the University of Pennsylvania School of Arts and Sciences in Biology and Chemistry, so we can compare notes there. University of Pennsylvania Biomedical Graduate Studies in Immunology, University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, postgraduate training and fellowship appointments. So, but you actually are a very vocal patient safety advocate, which as a surgeon makes you, in my book, a superhero. I'm just going to let you know right now. I think in terms of your concern over the well-being of patients, I've written the book Cures versus Profits about this tension between the push for high monetary yield from medical options versus medical options that are truly efficacious. But now, through your own personal journey, you for years you have been a very balanced voice in terms of, medicine helps, but sometimes it can hurt. How do we thread that needle? And so that's why I'm really honored to have you on the show. Let's talk a little bit about this letter, if you could, and see what you have to say. The letter warning to FDA and Pfizer on the immunological danger of COVID-19 vaccination in the recently convalescent and asymptomatic carriers. I've read it, but why don't you take the floor here, and I'll let you describe what your concerns were.
Sure. Well, James, thanks very much for your kind words on the front end of this interview. I think, of course, your characterization is very generous, but I think ideally, in an ideal space, most physicians are not only advocates for sort of medical practices and principles that benefit the majority of patients, but also have a good handle on, what we need to be doing to prevent minority harm. So in other words, if there are areas and spaces in our utilitarian medical practices where there's an opportunity to mitigate or avoid avoidable and mitigatable harm to minority subsets of people, I think that conditions to meet that need.
That was my experience too. When I was at UPCI under Ronald Herberman, University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, my appointment at the Department of Pathology, the idea was, this particular chemotherapy might not be right for everyone. So let's see if we can possibly predict who might perform best and who might perform poorly. Not just on efficacy, but also on safety issues. So when I say that you're my hero over this issue, I don't mean to single you out, but I do mean to hold you to the proper understanding to my audience of where you're coming from. You don't deny that there's risks in medicine, and that's what we really need.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and that's the issue. I mean, the idea of risk, the two categories of risk that I like to think about are avoidable risks and unavoidable risks. There's no question there are spaces in which some risks are unavoidable or unpredictable, there are certainly spaces where the risk is avoidable and knowable in terms of scientific prognostication leading us to that risk, or full knowledge of a material risk. Making mitigation or avoidance a duty. So that's sort of the broad strokes of where I'm coming from. The actual philosophy, unfortunately, arose out of a very tragic and personal experience that my family had with medical harm. My wife was harmed by a medical device that was used unsafely for treatment of symptomatic uterine fibroids, and so this sort of the space that I'm in terms of patient advocacy and patient safety has basically evolved over the past decades, not only as a result of my training as a physician, immunologist, and surgeon, but also as someone who's been pretty much catastrophically personally affected.
I know about that story, and I'm very sorry about that. But in a very, very real way, these tragic events, they completely put a stripe down your back, right, in a spine into people that say, no, I'm not. Denialism of risk will not make risk go away. Right. So in a nutshell, and I hate to put up your personal experience in a nutshell, but there it is. Denialism of risk is only going to compound risk until it gets out of hand. And if you can imagine, if you didn't speak out, if you and your family didn't speak out over what happened, and that particular procedure kept going on and on and on to this day, then that's the experience of a lot of people that have had to fight for admission that yes, there are risks to certain medical procedures. So that's thank you for bringing that up, and having the fortitude that gives you the strength when you see a loved one suffer as you have, I know. And anyway, you're a good man. We've established that. Yeah.
I appreciate the kindness, and most of the credit for that particular patient safety campaign goes to my wife, whose name was Dr. Amy Reed. Yep. Yep. Anyway, so let's move on to this topic here that you've raised, and you're kind enough to invite me over.
Sorry.
And I, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm an immunologist by training. As you mentioned, I completed the PhD course of studies, as well as a postdoctoral fellowship, as well as about a decade's worth of NIH-funded research, directly supported in cellular immunology. So I'm a very staunch advocate for vaccinations. I mean, I know what vaccines can do. I know how they've changed the tapestry of world history. I'm fully cognizant of what pandemics and epidemics could do without herd immunity, and what the power of vaccines could be in really curtailing the vigor of these pandemics and epidemics. So, that's my starting point. However, I think as you alluded to, I think it's very unwise of any clinician or any public health regulator to assume that there's anything that we do is a panacea. That there are not any patient populations or subpopulations or classes of patients who are not in harm's way from indiscriminate use of any medical practice or product. Vaccines are included. Now, unfortunately, vaccines live in a very unique space because that there are just tremendously powerful protectionist regulatory mechanisms in place to protect the vaccine industry. Literally, it's impossible to give any sort of market feedback to the vaccine industry. And I think that's a defect. That's a regulatory
By market feedback, you mean product quality control.
That's right. Product quality control, in terms of any sort of defects or safety concerns. It's literally and virtually impossible for a consumer to say, look, here's what happened to me, and essentially interrogate that in any sort of consistent way using the court system. Now, there are mechanisms to report adverse outcomes, and if something is happening to a vast majority of people, obviously the product comes off the market. The problem is if the harm is to minority subsets of people, where the majority are somehow benefiting, that minority subset of people is at a massive disadvantage. And I think this is really a fundamental moral question for our society. Should we leave minority subsets of people in harm's way and exposed without any sort of defense? I think we've done this experiment in America before, obviously, right? I mean, I think the history of America is ripe with minority subsets of people being ignored, discriminated, dehumanized, and left to the wind, if you will. I don't think that is a medically ethical orientation with respect to medical treatments. Mm-hmm. And I think vaccines in that space, unfortunately, have sort of been caught in a regulatory mishap, frankly, where utilitarianism is winning over the principles of safety to minority subsets. Now, with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic, it's a very big problem, obviously. It's affecting every single one of us. Literally 320 million Americans need to become immune to this virus so that our society doesn't. So there's no question. I mean, we need to get to herd immunity somehow, and for this virus to become endemic so that we can proceed with sort of our economic and social goals in this country. Mm-hmm. And the idea of having to immunize 320 million people, I think, is not a bad idea from an immunological perspective. I think we need to somehow induce folks to become immune to this coronavirus. But the idea of doing so indiscriminately and not paying attention to exactly what kinds of people may actually be in harm's way in our quest to secure majority benefit, I think this is a critical error. And in fact, we could do more harm if we're not careful. So, in thinking about the vaccine, I think that the specific issue that you wanted to discuss with me, aside from all the sort of politics and the philosophizing, is, my suggestion that there's actually a very large subset or class of people currently in our country and in the world, frankly, that are susceptible to potential harm from this vaccine. And I believe these are the subset of people who have had recent prior infections. Essentially anyone over the past 10 to 11 months who had the COVID-19 infection is potentially at risk of harm, in my opinion, from an immunological prognostication perspective, right. At risk of harm for developing an adverse reaction. And we can discuss specifically mechanistically why I think this, but that's basically the class of people.
Sure, absolutely. So one of the indicators of potential serious COVID-19 disease is a Th2 skewed immune system. For those of you that have been paying attention to what that means, you want a Th balanced, some Th1, Th2 I think would be ideal, but there's something going on in the population that is causing Th2 skew. It tends to be autoreactive. It tends to be people tend to be prone to autoimmunity, and the people that are doing poorly with COVID-19 seem to mount too strong an immune reaction. And then we have the long-haul COVID. So if we talk about COVID-19 itself for a while, long-haul COVID appears to be, I've interviewed Bruce Patterson, MD, the absence of germinal centers, right? And I don't know if you know anything else to add about that. I'm curious about what you've read and what you know about long-haul COVID and the whole thing. Let's talk about COVID first, yeah.
Well, yeah, so I think this is a worthwhile discussion to have. I think very early in the trajectory of this pandemic in our country, back in March of 2020, March, April, in that time frame, it was starting to become clear that the folks who are getting most significantly ill are folks whose T cells and macrophages are hyperactive. Now, whether the T cells are going down this classical trajectory of Th1 or Th2, I think there's some debate on that, but there's no question that people who are getting severely ill are really suffering from a sort of a hyperactivation syndrome, if you will, of T cells and macrophages. There's eosinophilia and cytokines and all of that's out of check. IL-5 is elevated. We've talked about that here, so yeah. Yeah, so I think there's a whole sort of a mishmash of inflammatory cells and pathways that get activated. But without a question, because this is a virally triggered process, the inciting cells are going to be the macrophages and dendritic cells and T cells interacting with the T cells and sort of pushing that inflammatory cascade and activating it. So one of the things that I have been advocating for from the beginning of this pandemic has been the idea of using classical T cell immunosuppressive agents, like things like cyclosporin, that really dampen the vigor of the immune response, both in case of acute COVID as well as in the case of long haul COVID, which probably is this sort of continuation of unameliorated T cell and macrophage activation, just as sort of an inflammatory cascade that never goes back to rest. So those are sort of separate elements. But I think what's really sort of to bring this back to the warning that I issued to the FDA and to Pfizer, one of my concerns has been that once an individual has been naturally infected and the virus has replicated in the body of this person, once viral replication ceases, even when there's no mRNA detectable, even when the patient is convalesced, there is very, very good basic science literature supporting this idea that antigens from these kinds of viruses and bacteria persist in the tissues of the previously infected for very, very long periods of time. In fact, there was a Nature paper that I recently submitted to the FDA from 2015, as recent as 2015, demonstrating that several different types of viruses, including influenza virus, the antigens from these viruses, meaning the protein moieties, protein and peptide moieties, from these viruses persist in the bodies of the infected for quite a long time, on the order of 6 to 8 months.
Do you know if there's any specific mechanism by which they persist? Are they continuously expressed, or where are they?
I don't think they're expressed in the sense that the mRNA or DNA has been integrated in the genome. I think these are basically just, if you will, this is the carcass. These are the carcasses of the virus essentially remaining throughout the system. Essentially, the protein, and they have no autonomous capacity for replication anymore. But nonetheless, they're persisting in the system, and it's antigen-presenting cells that are holding on to them. Things like Langerhans cells, dendritic cells, macrophages, right? And this is actually a topic that for many years cellular immunologists have been aware of. It's one of the mechanisms.
That makes sense.
Cell memory.
If the APCs are hanging on to them, then they're actually, what this means, folks, is in your immune system, the antigen-presenting cells, and there's a variety of types of them, actually offer real antigen to MHC-presenting molecules that say, oh, yes, I'm a match, or no, I'm not a match. And the long-haul COVID, I don't know if you've heard about the lack of germinal centers, as well as a low CD8 cell count appears to be predictive of long-haul COVID. So we have a problem with that. And a lot of people in my community are going to say, well, wait a minute, Jack, what about the fact that you have aluminum in the body? Aluminum adheres to tissue, right? We have very, very well-characterized long-term persistence of aluminum on tissues that can lead to autoreactivity in those organs. With speculation, I would take it at this point to see if aluminum is involved. But thank you for pointing out that if it appears to involve antigen presentation cells, then it's going to be around a while.
Well, there certainly are examples of heavy metals. Lead being the big example, right? Persisting in tissues. When you think about what a tattoo is, for example, a tattoo is basically pigments, dyed pigments being held onto by antigen-presenting cells, macrophages, Langerhans cells, dendritic cells. And so I think that the idea that our bodies can hold on to any variety of heavy metals or proteins is not really a novel one. Certainly in immunology, we already know that, let's say you reject an organ transplant, or let's say you reject a skin graft, or let's say you reject, you convalesce from a viral infection. We already know the basic science is quite solid on this, that these antigens, the protein antigens, can stick around in macrophages, dendritic cells, other antigen-presenting cells for extended periods of time. Now, let's take that concept and superimpose it on COVID-19, where we have a situation where somewhere around 20 to 30 million Americans are currently recently infected, recently meaning in the past 10 months, right? These individuals' tissues contain viral antigens. It's almost a certainty from a scientific perspective. that the bits and pieces of viral proteins and peptides are still persistent. Now you come along and vaccinate that individual and you rekindle this T cell response, which is what the vaccine does quite effectively. What you end up getting is these T cells then transmigrate throughout the body and target whatever places there are that these antigens are persisting. And that's a problem. I mean, I think if you are, say, a 30-year-old and you experience this, it may very well be that if your heart muscle contains viral antigens persisting, you may be able to tolerate this, 3 days of tachycardia and myocarditis. But if you're 70 or 80 years old and your heart gets retargeted by these inflammatory cells, well, you could develop sudden cardiac death because, you develop heart block, or you could, this is not a novel concept. Patients, there are examples in the literature of patients dying of viral myocarditis from heart block, from sudden heart block. So you have a scenario where a virus goes to the heart. We already know that COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 goes to the myocardium and causes myocarditis. So here you are, you come back, you vaccinate the person, and you reactivate this immune response. And what you get is reactivated myocarditis in a patient who may not have the reserve to tolerate this, may go into heart.
That makes so much sense. So you sent this letter to the FDA on the immunological danger. Did they give you a response?
They did. I was privileged to hear back from both Dr. Peter Marks, who's the director of the Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research. I even heard directly back from Dr. Janet Woodcock, who's now the acting commissioner, as recently as last week. And I also heard from the senior vice president of Pfizer back in December of 2020. The gentleman's name is Dr. Bill Gruber. Dr. Gruber, of course, points to the clinical trials that Pfizer did and stated to me that this is not a concern, that we already have vaccinated about 300 to 400 asymptomatic carriers, and we haven't seen a danger signal, a safety signal. Of course, my response to that is, first of all, the subset is not powered enough, and secondly, you haven't included folks who are elderly and frail with underlying cardiovascular disease in that subset. So it's an incomplete clinical study, so you can't really claim that that immunizing indiscriminately previously infected people is actually safe. So that's basically the outline of it, James.
So what if you care to share here, if you don't want to share, that's fine. You may have other publication needs for this information, but what was the FDA's response?
Well, unfortunately not satisfactory, I'll be honest. Dr. Marks was very kind and polite in his email, but he stated to me that the agency scientists and outside experts don't agree with my risk prognostication. So in other words, their guess is better than my guess, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is a completely inadequate answer. Dr. Woodcock, I think, was a lot more keen and has been listening very carefully. So I maintain hope that the FDA commissioner will actually pay careful attention. I do think that there are some very clear anecdotes of this emerging right now.
Well, there may be another reason why people who have received who already had COVID-19 infection might eventually be able to forego vaccination for a couple of reasons beyond safety. I recently interviewed Cheryl Atkinson, which she said you saw of Representative Massey, who called out the CDC for saying that 95% efficacy in the Pfizer trial actually was relevant to people that used to have had a prior COVID-19 infection, even though their own data showed that there was zero efficacy, non-significant negative efficacy, in fact. And so hopefully there'll be some time in the near future where we might be able to sort this out a little bit better. What would you look for in a patient, or what should be looked for? And I want to bring up this next, your latest article, which is the safe way to get your COVID-19 vaccine, #screen before vaccine, which I labeled on the add for this. So, what is it that we're looking for here in people that used to have had a recent or convalescent recent infection? What is it that we might look for in terms of biomarkers that would indicate that a person's at risk?
Well, that's a really great question. I mean, I think essentially my message to the public and to our public health officials is that we should not be indiscriminately vaccinating folks who have had prior infections. There's several reasons for that. We discussed the sort of potential pathophysiology of harm, but also there are more practical reasons. Right now, we know that people who've been naturally infected, James, for the most part, the vast majority are already naturally immune.
That's right.
And that is, that is indicated by the fact that the vast majority of these folks actually mount IgG responses that you can detect in their blood to SARS-CoV-2. So the very fact that we're re-immunizing these folks, I think, is essentially in a setting where we have limited vaccine supply, we're taking those shots away from people who are not immune, right? So just purely from an economic perspective, it makes a heck of a lot of sense to not vaccinate people who are already immune. They're already immune, right? Not to mention,
doesn't that qualify as an unnecessary medical procedure? Even, I mean, we can go there, right?
I would say it's not only unnecessary because the definition of immunity is the presence of IgG in the serum. And not only is it unnecessary, but in the setting of recent infection, it's actually a breach of standard of care. Under normal circumstances, we never, if a patient comes into a doc's office, I have an infection, I just had the flu, that patient's not going to get the flu shot. Or if a patient comes in with an active viral infection, we're not vaccinating those folks for a very good reason, because traditionally we know that you don't want to exacerbate an inflammatory response.
Well, let's stay on that point for a minute. I have a question about that because the CDC actually kind of relaxed that a little bit. They used to say you may not want to get this shot to the patient on the vaccine information statements. Now they say talk to your physician. And then the CDC's official stance is, if you're unconscious, there's a standing order to vaccinate if you're unconscious in the custody of hospital staff. So there seems to be some built-in codified risks in the interpretation of the CDC's policy. Talking to your physician and saying, well, should I get this or not? Do I have a fever? Traditionally it used to be if you have a fever, you shouldn't vaccinate. Now CDC is like, no, there's no evidence that it's a problem.
Well, I think that's a purely irresponsible maneuver on the part of the CDC. I think that essentially it sort of fits into this paradigm of vaccinate maximally as fast as possible. Yeah. Look, I got my own shots. I've had both shots of the Mrna Vaccine. I had no issues. I had the first vaccination, I barely felt it. The second vaccination, I felt a little malaise the next day, and I tolerated fine. I have IgG circulating in my serum. I know that I'm immune against this. But when I was consented for this vaccine, they did ask me, "Hey, have you had COVID? Do you have a fever?" They asked me all the traditional questions that we would ask. And I hope that everyone does that. But, the reality is that the vast majority of folks, James, are infected, not a vast majority, but a substantial proportion of people have infections that are asymptomatic. In other words, they don't know that they're infected.
I think what you want to say is that most people who have the infection are asymptomatic. So in terms of total percentage, if we're looking at any time, there's maximum 2 to 3% prevalence. And then you add another 85% on top of that. So that makes the 15%. I recently did the math on this. Interesting you bring it up that way, because if we had, 20 million cases that are diagnosed so far, if that represents 15% of the total number of cases, then if you only count the adults, then we're already past the herd immunity level for SARS-CoV-2. And so I'm not trying to dissuade anyone from getting the vaccine, but I think we need to take this seriously. It's because World Health Organization recently redefined herd immunity, right, as immunity achieved through vaccination. They're trying to change the actual nature of human immunity and how things work in populations. And I'd like your thoughts on that, if you care to comment on what happens if we reach herd immunity.
Look, I don't want to necessarily speculate on, how many people are currently. I think we do know that at least 20 million people have been naturally infected. Right. I have no idea I have no idea how many total people have had natural infections. I do believe that a slice of the herd immunity pie will be the naturally immune.
Yeah.
And really my focus is, we don't know how long natural immunity versus vaccine immunity will last. Those are all very good questions.
Sure.
But I do think that we need to sort of step back a little bit and get off this locomotive that's going at Mach speed, where we're just indiscriminately vaccinating everyone. Folks who've been naturally immune, not only is there an argument from an economic perspective in terms of getting enough vaccines to everyone, there's not only an economic argument to not vaccinating those folks acutely, but there's also a safety concern here. And yes, I agree. My critics have told me this is a prognosticated risk. And I totally agree that that's a prognosticated risk. But in a setting where...
Explain what that means. Explain what that means. What do they mean by prognosticated myth? Yeah, go ahead.
So what I mean is that I'm acting like a weatherman, essentially. I'm saying, look, this and this principle is sort of lining up, and it's allowing me to predict that problem Z is going to be the problem. So if we're talking about safety, what we need to do is we need to mitigate against real and potential prognosticated risks, and especially in a setting where we're vaccinating about 1 million people a day. It's you can't just ignore very fundamental scientifically based prognostics. It's sort of like what Boeing did with the 737 MAX, right? It's like they knew there's a risk in this design, but they tolerated it because somehow the majority of people who are going to be on these Boeing planes are going to be just fine. The risk is extremely low, and they don't know if it's a material risk or not until the two planes crash, and that's like, at that point it's too late. So
I'm glad you brought up that analogy. That's a very apt analogy. So you're getting my brain buzzing, because I think part of the problem in risk assessment of vaccines versus viruses is that as you call it, Mach speed, vaccinate everybody as quickly as possible. The concept is that this is kind of a natural exposure that's just happening once you have a vaccination program. And in reality, it's a man-made event. Each individual vaccination event, the design of the vaccines, these are man-made, as opposed to the adverse health that comes from a virus, that comes with a certain amount of chance and risk of just being a human being on a planet. You're going to be exposed to viruses, but you're not necessarily going to have to be exposed to both the risk of the virus and the vaccine in this complex setting. You're all acutely aware, I think, of the antibody-dependent enhancement experience with past vaccines. In these animal trials, I don't know if you're aware, but they didn't use ferrets like they used to. They used rhesus macaque monkeys, and Darja Kent-Duke and Yehuda Schoenfeld argue that specific animal, the non-human primate rhesus macaque, has a very strange respiratory immune response. Well, immune response to respiratory infections. It's atypical. And that I noticed when I read Moderna's study and Pfizer's study, they only looked at lung immunopathology. They didn't look at spleen and liver and brain and other places where the animal studies. They didn't look at senescent animals, right? So we'd have no idea if the older humans are at risk of disease and antibody-dependent disease enhancement. And oddly, I'm not saying they did it on purpose, but they cited a bunch of cytokines, and they cited they reported a bunch of interleukins, but they never mentioned IL-5. I'm not even sure if they mentioned IL-13, and these are two key known indicators of antibody-dependent enhancement or disease enhancement. And so, not to scare anybody, but yeah, I mean, let's take a really good look. And there's nothing stopping them from doing ferret studies right now. There's nothing that would stop them from doing it. I think if they really want to get a gold star as the saviors of humanity, do the ferret studies now. That's what I would advocate.
Well, look, I think that there are two things that I think we need to sort of be very clear on. Coronaviruses are relatively simple viruses compared to something like HIV, for example, or herpes virus, right? They're pretty simple viruses. They cause the common cold. What makes SARS-CoV-2 different is that it imposes because of its tissue tropism and targeting selectivity for the respiratory endothelium and vascular endothelium and the heart. I think it introduces a mortality risk, and that's what makes it different from other coronaviruses. But in truth, I think if we actually sort of look at the basic science of coronaviruses, it's a reasonable bet that if you have an IgG response evolved against this virus, and if you have primed T cells that have presumably participated in that IgG response, that you have a reasonable chance that this is actually going to be protected for the vast majority of people. Now, again, I'm going to put in quotes the vast majority of people.
Right.
I think the vast majority of people do benefit and will benefit from the protective immunity that this imparts. The problem is the minority subsets of people who have not been studied in the clinical trials and who we have good reason to avoid immunizing. And I think that the biggest class, really the most unusual thing that we're doing, James, in this pandemic is we are deploying a mass-scale vaccine campaign in the midst of an outbreak.
Yeah.
This has never happened before. I mean, this is really, if you think about what the only element of this whole approach for vaccination that's unprecedented is that we are deploying a large-scale, global-level vaccine strategy in the midst of an outbreak, where
go ahead, finish your thought. Yeah.
Yeah, where 20 to 30% of people, up to 20 to 30% of people, have already been infected before. So I think what we need to do is we need to screen out the folks who've been previously infected and avoid vaccination. It's not out of this world. I mean, this is a doable thing.
It's totally reasonable. Thus, they're identifiable. I mean, you've got the medical, right? And so what I was going to say is that we've had outbreaks during mass vaccination, all right? And in fact, due to waning efficacy of vaccines, we're starting to see mumps and pertussis, and I would say measles resurgences because of the evolution of the viruses away. The vaccine type is evolving away from the wild type. And that has to be addressed, but and there are complexities, immunologic complexities that happen when you have an outbreak, and then you're also tweaking the immune system of people with the vaccine. So thanks for bringing that up. So on your hashtag Screen Before Vaccine program, I think I asked this earlier. I just want to be sure I didn't miss it. But what can we do clinically? What are the actionable clinical indicators beyond that you've had COVID-19 that you think might be useful in saying this person might not do that well under a vaccine, with a COVID-19
that's
vaccine?
a great question. You did ask that, and I apologize. I didn't directly answer the question, but I wanted to get back to it. So I think that there are two mechanisms. There are really three assays that we currently have that are pretty widely available, at least in the Western Hemisphere. That's the PCR test, which picks up replicating mRNA. The rapid test, which picks up viral proteins. That's the rapid test.
Yep.
And we have the antibody test, which pick up antibodies specific for SARS-CoV-2. These are the three different screening tests that we have available, and they're pretty widely available. And most centers, most urgent cares offer these. So those are the three ways that you can actually screen an individual. There's certainly a category of people who already know they've had COVID, right? Those individuals should probably, the best strategy for those individuals is to go in and get an IgG screen. If they are IgG positive, it means that they've mounted a productive immune response. Those folks could sit tight because they're highly likely to be immune. Then you have another category of folks who are recently infected, and those recently infected folks, most likely will be able to get their screens come up positive on PCR and rapid test. There certainly are people who've been recently infected, but they've cleared the virus and antigen, but they could be IgG positive. Mm-hmm. So I would advocate getting any combination of these tests before you get a vaccine. Now, you could also risk stratify it. You don't have to do it to 320 million Americans. You could say, look, people who are elderly and frail with significant cardiovascular disease, these are at the highest risk, so screen those people very stringently. And for the rest of the healthy population, leave it up to their choice, right? Give them the risk assessment and say, look, you could be safest by screening yourself if you want to. You're relatively low risk, but go ahead and screen yourself if you want to before the vaccine.
That's great. So people that are thinking about taking the vaccine, once they get tested, what if they have prior evidence of autoimmunity? I mean, certainly if you've had an anaphylactic reaction to the PEG, polyethylene glycol, that's an indicator. That's currently active indicator. But what about a generic family history of autoimmunity? Would these people maybe think twice about it because they already? Is there some way should they get their Th2 cell counts? If your Th2 skewed, are you likely to do bad on the vaccine if you have Th2 skew as well?
I don't know if the data, if the evidence in terms of doing any kind of screening like that is solid enough to advocate. Certainly don't know if there are any feasible screening strategies available. Like I said, the screening process that I was proposing, this is already in place. The PCR, the rapid test, and IgG. So, I think in terms of autoimmune diseases, certainly people who've had reactions like Guillain-Barré, reactions to vaccine, certainly people who've had anaphylactic reactions to vaccine before should really think twice about getting the vaccine. People with family histories of things like thyroiditis, for example, or multiple sclerosis, I think it's a little bit, it's going to be a little bit hard to make a blanket statement because those diseases themselves are very complicated. Now, if you have, let's say you have multiple sclerosis and you're in remission, right? I would probably think very carefully about not getting this vaccine, right? I mean, if you're have a very severe autoimmune disease, let's say inflammatory bowel disease, let's say you have ulcerative colitis and you've had several bouts of attacks, I would probably think very carefully about getting this vaccine, or really any vaccine, frankly, because of the possibility of a cross-activation phenomenon. But again, it's very difficult to sort of make blanket statements regarding people with autoimmune diseases. Like people with type 1 diabetes, I know that there have been several deaths already post-vaccination in patients who have type 1 diabetes. What is the mechanism behind that, or are these deaths even related? It's hard to tell. But is it possible that there's some sort of dysregulation that happens with glucose metabolism that makes people prone to sudden death who are type 1 or type 2 diabetics? It's possible. Yeah. I don't know.
Well, I'd love to see prospective sampling just on a blood draw before vaccination of people that have autoimmunity in their family or prior autoimmunity across the nation. And it's stored, and for the people who have serious adverse reactions or who die, for these mysterious deaths that can't be attributed to vaccines, let's see if there's some biomarkers in their blood, or clinical demographic variables, the multiple indicator biomarker, prediction modeling. That's my thing. Machine learning based phased biomarker development. That's I do that for fun. So I would love to get a hold of a large data set. I mean, I don't want to see 3,000 people die. Don't get me wrong, but for everybody that dies, if we had a prior blood screen, then we could actually learn something and do, retrospectively, we could see if we could have predicted. And since the vaccines are liability free, what's the big deal? It's not like the family's going to bound together and then sue the vaccine makers. They can't. They have to go to vaccine court. But that might also be a blessing for them to be able to take, that result from that blood screen and say, yes, they're part of this. They had Th2 skew or they had whatever biomarkers come up. I think it's important that we do this because there are so many families. There's so much social division over vaccinating versus not vaccinating. Over, you're putting my child at risk if you don't vaccinate, even though my kid's vaccinated. There's so much social discord. If we could just learn a panel of biomarkers, it would be so rational to say, if you want your vaccine, take it, but we're going to screen you first. It would just be so rational. It makes so much sense. So what's the reaction been? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. In general, I mean, I think the idea of personalizing the delivery of medical care. In fact, if you look at the evolution of medicine, that's exactly what's happened. You're going from the time where we used to use bloodletting as the panacea treatment for everyone, to now where leeches, right? And to now where we individually look at each patient's particular symptomatology. Medicine is becoming increasingly personalized. So I think what you're alluding to in terms of these kinds of diagnostic tests for
the prognostic, the prognostic
tests and diagnostic tests both. I think this is a worthy cause. But I think in the case of this national catastrophe that we're in right now, this is really truly a sort of a wartime situation, if you will, in many ways. I think we still have a duty to balance the idea of majority benefit with minority harm. I mean, even in wartime situations, let's say, the United States decides to take out a high value target somewhere in the world, right? it is still incumbent on those military leaders to do something like that to reduce collateral damage.
But they might wait until the place is closed or something, right? They might do it after everybody goes home. That's the exact analogy, right? You have to take out this, but let's do it in a way that does the minimum collateral damage. And I don't mean to offend anybody who has a vaccine-injured child or lost a child, but calling them collateral damage. People know, my support is where's the monument in front of the CDC for the family of dead children, and to those dead children who died so that we could have a pediatric schedule. Where's the celebration of the sacrifice that was made? And so it's the exact same thing. We're just not. This is why I started talking with you at the top of this, saying you don't believe that denial of risk is going to make the risk go away, and that's to be celebrated. Right. It's so important. We can get totally beyond. And I want to depoliticize public health. I want to demonetize, or not demonetize, our health should not be a commodity. We have to figure out a way, because it's unsustainable to create bigger and bigger and bigger hospitals for a sicker and sicker population. It just doesn't work.
James, when I was doing my surgical residency, I don't know if you're familiar with this concept, but most academic programs have a morbidity and mortality conference. And during these morbidity and mortality conferences, what physicians do is they get together and they discuss recent outcomes and complications that happen, right? Yeah. One of the big things that we would do as part of our responsibility as chief residents was we would distinguish between avoidable and unavoidable complications, right? And both kinds of complications and adverse outcomes are equally tragic to family members. But really, from a duty perspective, from the perspective of public health or a physician's duty, the worst kind of complications are the ones that are avoidable, meaning that you actually had the ability to identify the folks who were at risk, and you failed to identify those risks, and you subjected the patient to whatever it was that they got subject to, and then they died. Right. So that's aside from even a technical situation where you've made a technical error in practice, right?
You just didn't know that the risk was there, right? Sure.
You just knew that a subset of patients or a particular patient is in harm's way or maybe in harm's way, and you did nothing to mitigate.
Right.
Those are the worst kinds of complications. And again, you're absolutely right. This is not in any way to downplay the magnitude of loss that some families experience. There's absolutely no question that we need to study and we need to develop a very acute sense of what the parameters are that go into people experiencing complications. But look, if there's a massive subset of people that are very highly likely to be in harm's way, you have to mitigate.
That's the low-hanging fruit. That's the low-hanging fruit. That's easy. You've had COVID-19. Let's not put them at additional risk. It's all risk and no benefit. And that's a good thing. So what's the general reaction in the medical community to screen before vaccine?
Well, unfortunately, I've basically seen nothing but pushback. I mean, the major pushback against my argument here is that, number one, it's theoretical. And number two, it's going to cause more harm than good. It's going to cause people to become vaccine hesitant. And my argument is actually it's quite the opposite. In fact, if you respect people's intelligence, if you discuss with people safety concerns, you actually can earn people's trust. You can, I think most Americans are quite capable of reasoning autonomously. In fact, that's our national hallmark, is that we are capable of independently and individually adjudicating right from wrong. So this idea that, you start discussing this with the people, you're going to cause vaccine hesitancy, I think it's complete ludicrous. I think it's intellectually lazy. I think the physicians and public health regulators who believe that this idea of screen before vaccine is going to cause vaccine hesitancy are frankly completely disrespecting the autonomy and intelligence of every single American in our country.
Boy, I'm so really glad you said that, because they have it exactly backwards. They not only is it ludicrous, they have it exactly backwards. The source of vaccine hesitancy is vaccine injury and death. It's not that, I heard it on the internet, or they're spreading misinformation. It's parents that actually say, that happened to my child. They had eczema, the doctor said it wasn't an indicator, and the next thing you know, they're having these terrible seizures. They're telling me the seizures are fine after vaccination, it's normal, and then whatever becomes from that encephalitis or encephalopathy. The point is, the screen before a vaccine program would actually take some of those people out of potential harm's way. And taking them out of harm's way, there'd be fewer coincidences, right? Fewer adverse events. Because there's fewer adverse events, there's less ammunition in the vaccine hesitancy arsenal. And it's mind-blowing. Thank you for pointing out it's intellectually lazy, but it's actually self-defeating. The denialist program is self-defeating.
It's also disingenuous. I mean, one of the people who very publicly has come after me is an academic surgeon by the name of David Gorski from Wayne State. And he came after me because I think there's a publication by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the defender, who that picked up this article that I wrote, this Pfizer letter that you put up front, and I had nothing to do with the defender picking it up. I didn't go and tell him to, hey, please publish this. They picked it up because I guess they look into safety issues. So Dr. Gorski turns around and directs fire at me, right, for causing vaccine hesitancy, and in the process it becomes very clear that there's a whole core of people, there's a whole arsenal of,
a small vocal group of people that go around beating other people up. Yeah.
To me, it's striking because, the reality is that these folks calling the folks who are hesitant about vaccine safety stupid, or saying that they're not intelligent, or somehow they're anti-science. I think this is going to create more problem than good. I mean, look,
absolutely.
The 50% of America that's going to get the vaccine is going to get the vaccine. The 50% of America that's not going to get the vaccine, you probably have about half of those folks who just will never get the vaccine.
Right.
And you have another half who are legitimately concerned about safety issues. And if you actually engage these folks and explain to them what the legitimate scientific concerns could be, you can actually earn these folks' trust. And I bet you many of these folks will actually get the vaccine once they realize that, they can do something to keep themselves safe.
Well, imagine if medical science actually progressed beyond just name calling, which is what Gorski does, beyond just, character assassination, which is what Gorski does, beyond, just, I don't know, begging for a street fight, I guess. He's not very high-minded in his approach to criticizing people.
I'll be honest with you. I was actually shocked by his response because I know his academic pedigree quite well. He's an MD PhD. He's an academic surgeon, right? I mean, this is the kind of individual who should actually be substantially more dignified.
He could be an immense value if he understood the correct pathway to rational, healthy immunity for the human population. He does not do vaccine research. He's not anywhere. He's nowhere near qualified to say that you're wrong. You're an immunologist. He's a surgeon. He's just
in fairness to surgeons, I think I actually initially when I communicated with Dr. Gorski, I felt that he maybe there is a chance to actually reason with this individual because he's an academic physician and a physician scientist. I mean, he has an MD PhD. He does research. Right. He's certainly not an immunologist. I can tell you that. And in defense of surgeon scientists, James, I think that there's some very, very decorated surgeon scientists.
I've worked with many of them.
Yeah. So there's nothing against surgeons who are scientists.
But specifically, his specialty does not put him in the expert seat anyway in terms of vaccine safety science, how clinical science on vaccine safety could or should be done. I mean, when I read his critiques, they're not of the caliber of even the peer review comments that I give or that I get when I study vaccine vaccine safety science.
I think he's mostly writing for shock value and entertainment value, to be honest. And
that's not useful.
It's a very binary set of arguments. It doesn't leave room for any sort of nuance, frankly. And I think in this particular situation that we're in, nuance is everything. I mean, if in fact in the safety equation, nuance is everything. Because if you apply something, a treatment to everyone as a panacea, then you're basically ignoring the fact that there may be safety concerns or there are safety concerns, and that's the biggest defect that I think he exhibits. But anyway, so he was one of the major guys who came after me, and unfortunately, there are others who don't want to engage in conversation. For example, Dr. Paul Offit who was a member of the faculty at the graduate group that I did my PhD in. Dr. Offit is a very well-decorated academic physician. He's clearly one of the leaders in the vaccine, science field, and he sits on the FDA's advisory panel for vaccines. So he's been sitting on these committees that approved each one of these. I approached him with this concern, and he knows exactly who I am. I did my PhD at Penn. I was in the graduate group where he's a faculty member. I spent 7 years doing research there. I was on the faculty at Penn. He doesn't want to have the conversation even with me. So that's a problem. And I know that Dr. Offit's been on the receiving end of a lot of, unfair criticism from folks who have, been harmed by vaccines or feel like they've been harmed by vaccines. But that does not justify the turning off of a scientifically cogent discourse.
So I'll tell you, if I can translate what the vaccine risk-aware community says about Dr. Paul Offit, they're just using different language than you're using. It's the same criticism. They expect more of a person that has those credentials. And they really would hope. I mean, there's a contingent of people that reached out to him to try to, bridge the gap. There's certainly, if there's a fence, there's certainly, lots of crap that's been thrown over both sides of the fence, right? The very use of the term anti-vaxxer to dismiss somebody's credentials as if being objective about vaccine safety science makes you an anti-vaxxer. And I agree with you 100% that, the approach to dismiss or deny, or worse, to attack, firms up a person's position to say, well, wait a minute, if you're going to go after me and I have to defend myself over something that I'm simply asking questions about, and you're telling me that after a lifetime of asking questions in my scientific career, you can't ask that question, I'm going to continue to ask that question. That's just my nature, And so it doesn't mean that I'm biased. It just means that I really, okay, fine. There must be a minority that's underserved here. Give me an underdog, I'll fight for him any day. That's my weakness. If you want to know my Achilles heel, put me in a position where there's, I might not always fight for the right underdog, but, the great equalizer here is science, and I'm not the final arbiter of that. It's a community endeavor. So I would
look, and I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for the group of for Dr. Offit and people like him who've been subject to unfair treatment. I mean, when a mob comes after you, right? It becomes very difficult, and especially if you're dealing with sort of non-science motivated folks. People are very emotional. I've been on the receiving end of that, and I think that I can understand sort of the difficult position that someone like Dr. Offit is in. But I think once the approach is coming from a perspective of science in a very rational way, and again, I fully accept that currently there is no evidence for what I've brought to the FDA's attention. My point is, by the time the evidence emerges, it'll be a fait accompli, meaning the harm is going to be done already. Right. So my question for Dr. Marks, for Dr. Woodcock, for Dr. Offit, for Dr. Borla at Pfizer, for Dr. Gruber, has been, we have this population of 20 to 30% of the world's population right now that have been naturally infected and are probably immune already.
Yeah.
Why are we indiscriminately vaccinating these folks?
What is the evidence? How do we take advantage of that immunity? That's what your point is.
Number one, why don't we take advantage of the immunity? Number two, how do we know it's safe in these folks? And especially in the vulnerable categories, the elderly, the frail, the institutionalized, people who are obese with diabetes or with cardiovascular risk factors.
100%.
I don't think they know the answer, James.
And
I think this, it's so let's keep marching forward, I guess.
That's right. So the clinical trial populations are not representative for those other populations. And, you have to take the full set of results seriously, right? There's no efficacy, zero efficacy for people who have had COVID-19 diagnosis. It might be even a little negative, but it's not significant. The Asian population had 44% efficacy. What do we do about that? Does that mean that if you've already had COVID-19 and you are of Asian descent, that you really shouldn't get the vaccine? I mean, these are compound inferences, but it's not like, oh my God, roll my eyes, it's so complicated, I just want to go home. We do compound inferences all the time. It's really straightforward. I'm going to go to the bank first, then I'm going to go to the shopping. But if I do it the opposite direction, I'm not going to have money when I go shopping. Okay, so whatever. It's not complicated. It's not rocket science, is what I'm saying. But if there's any chance whatsoever of a building group of physicians across the country that would like to start banking blood before they vaccinate, so that someone, doesn't have to be me at IPAC, so that someone can look at a panel of biomarkers, cytokines, CD8 cells, whatever, to retrospectively say we could have predicted, and next year we can do a better job at minimizing vaccine risk. Anybody that argues against that, I would say, is irrational. Not just,
well, I think some of that's already. I think some of that's already happening, James. I do think that
I hope so.
The companies and a lot of academic physicians are doing some of that. But again, I mean, I think the low-hanging fruit really is not only from an economic perspective, meaning from a vaccine economic perspective, where we have a limited commodity that needs to be distributed maximally. The idea of vaccinating the already immune is incorrect from an economic perspective. But from a patient safety perspective, I think, I don't know if you heard about this very tragic case from Memphis, Tennessee. It was a 36-year-old surgeon by the name of Dr. J. Barton Williams. Mm-hmm. This gentleman had apparently had an asymptomatic case of COVID-19. Sounds like several weeks prior to his vaccination. He was otherwise healthy, apparently, and sort of doing fine. He gets his vaccine shots, and within several days, he develops this very severe inflammatory disease process, ends up in the ICU, and passes away. Now, this man is a 36-year-old man. He's a surgeon. He's a graduate of Harvard College. He did his medical school at the University of Tennessee, did his residency training at the University of Utah, was only married about 6 or 7 weeks when all this happened. So this is really a tragic, just when you think about it from a social cost perspective, when a person like this is very similar to my own wife's story. Amy Reed was a 40-year-old anesthesiologist, MD, PhD, trained at the highest levels of the system and was a faculty member at Harvard Medical School, and a catastrophe happens to her. So Dr. Williams's case really from a patient harm perspective really parallels what happened to my family. What happened to Dr. Williams was that he was a prior carrier of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. He gets immunized. He develops a vaccine, a COVID-19 related inflammatory reaction, and then he dies, right? The way his physicians, now the family is extremely courageous. They've given permission for the physicians to talk to the press. Now here's the way the physicians who took care of him are portraying this to the press, that this was a delayed immune reaction to COVID-19, that if he had gotten his vaccine prior to his infection, this would have never happened to him. That's all true. But the thing that they're missing,
it's not explanatory.
Well, the thing that they're missing is that the thing that triggered him to become this ill was actually the vaccine. It was highly likely to have been the vaccine, right? Yeah. So in other words, he goes from being an asymptomatic carrier, getting vaccinated, that's the sequence. Asymptomatic carrier, is perfectly asymptomatic, has no problems, gets vaccinated, and within short order develops this massive inflammatory reaction that kills him. What they're doing in the press is they're saying, oh, this is not related to the vaccine. In fact, if he had gotten the vaccine before his infection, he would have been protected. And again, that's true enough. He probably would have been protected.
But it's irrelevant. But it's irrelevant
to the forensics of this case.
You have a causal pathway that includes the vaccine, and you can't argue it out of the causal pathway. That's what they're trying to do.
You can't argue it.
There's the thrombocytopenia. There's a doctor in Florida that died from thrombocytopenia, and there's another one in Florida. And I hate to say, I may have predicted those deaths in my April study because there's an S100A protein that's involved in the development of platelets. That perhaps these guys would have been just fine if those epitopes had been removed from the vaccine. The good news is for the mRNA vaccines, maybe next time. Right now they're updating the mRNA vaccine. I guess Moderna is to address the new variants, but perhaps they'll catch on to they can actually remove unsafe epitopes from the spike protein, and so maybe we might have less autoreactive conditions here.
Yeah, and I think that the physician in Florida, I guess, who passed away, he passed away from ITP,
Yeah.
and I think yes, and that's a very very unfortunate case, obviously, and really tragic. I do think that ITP is part of the sort of collage of vaccine-related complications that we see, and whether there are ways to predict that. I think, but as you're saying, if there are ways to identify folks who are susceptible, it's very important to do so. But I do think, look, the case of Dr. Williams is, I think, is a really loud safety signal. I mean, I think that the GYN down in Florida obviously is very tragic, but again, ITP is something that folks talk about in terms of severe vaccine complications, and so again, I'm not diminishing the magnitude of that tragedy, but in terms of just the idea that here we have an index case, a 36-year-old otherwise healthy guy has an asymptomatic infection, gets a vaccine, and gets pushed over the edge and dies. He's a 36-year-old guy. He may be one in, 5,000 in that category, one in 10,000. But if you do that to people who are in their 70s and 80s, who've had prior infections, and then what are we calling these guys? We're saying these guys are all dying of COVID. They're not saying, the vaccine triggered that inflammatory reaction. They just died of COVID, right? So we're not even looking at it with the right lens. This is a mistake. It's a mistake.
It is, and in the broader context of where our society's going, what we've lost in America and in other countries around the world is the understanding of the wisdom of the minority. We have the tyranny of the majority, and yet the wisdom of the minority, right? Why do we have a legal system where even the worst offenders are given access to defense? They're given access to defense in an adversarial system because the adversarial process helps bring out the truth, right? So we have to have an adversarial process. And the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program is not the place to do it. Vaccine risk denialism is infused throughout the special masters, I hate to be disrespectful, but they must drink a whole tall glass of vaccine risk denialism juice every morning, right? Because if you're an MD and you're defending the HHS, who's the defendant in the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, and by the way, that defendant also administers the program, they're going to take the word of an MD that says, no, it wasn't the vaccine, even though they've never examined the body, they've never ordered new tests, they've never anything like that if a person died, versus somebody that knows how to read the research science and says, 18 out of 21 indicators for ALS versus GBS supports GBS. This was GBS. It doesn't take a brain surgeon to count 18 out of 21 indicators. But no. We looked at your credentials. You don't have the background, so we're going to dismiss, everything that you've said thoroughly. I mean, it's not a good program. So we have to have an adversarial system somewhere to give, you called it the market feedback, the quality control feedback. It's free. It's free information to these corporations. They don't even have to do any market research. They have everything else going for them. At least they can take their vaccine injury seriously. Why bias VAERS? Why bias, the media? Let it out there that, yes, there's a problem, and go fix your product.
James, in the case of this this pandemic, though, I think that the vaccine lobby, for lack of a better term, has a little bit of a problem. I think, number one, these vaccines were approved under EUA. So there are actually... there are cracks in the regulatory armor, if you will.
Okay.
With an EUA, so that there is recourse with an EUA, but really the problem that they're confronting, and I wrote directly to the lead counsel at Pfizer about this, is that look, this is about not only protecting people's lives, but it's actually about protecting the integrity of the corporation itself. Because if you have a class of patients, you're talking about 20, 30 million people who are already infected right now.
Yeah.
If that's really a class of people whose indiscriminate vaccination is causing harm, that's a pretty big class of people to be leaving your corporation exposed to in a setting of a product that's under EUA. It's not even fully approved. So the problem is that the more we do this, the more these people who are potentially getting harmed is gonna build up, and there's gonna be an inflection point where the truth will be realized, and then the company is completely exposed. So why not? And this is really a simple proposal that I've given to Pfizer and to FDA on your warning labels for these vaccines. When you're talking about avoiding the vaccine in known cases of COVID, which they already state, just add 2 words: known or suspected. Mm-hmm. Okay, because when you add to that, you should avoid this vaccine in known or suspected patients with COVID-19 infection. What that does is it leaves it up to the patient, the consumer, and to the practitioner to decide whether or not, do I suspect this patient has? So they need to really tighten up their legal language, because otherwise they're leaving their corporation. Pfizer is leaving itself completely exposed.
I think the next letter that you should write should be to the board of directors and the investors of Moderna. Just an open letter to these guys and Pfizer, and say, you guys are putting yourself at risk. Because if they haven't put that together, they've got lawyers that can advise them on this. But if they're drinking their own Kool-Aid in terms of vaccine injury and risk denialism, that's not going to work. It's not sustainable. So.
Well, it's a similar situation to what Boeing had. What happened to Boeing, with the 737 MAX.
Exactly. So, Dr. Noorchashm, I can't tell you how grateful I and thousands, hopefully tens of thousands of people that see this video and hear our discussions are to get to know you. It's really good to get to know you. Have you written a book at any time?
I'm sorry, what?
Have you ever written a book?
No, I haven't.
Okay, that I would encourage, since you've got your author engines going on Medium.com, Hooman Noorchashm, I would consider putting a book together to tell the story of the decay of patient safety advocacy in the United States and what's going wrong. You're the right person for that message, and we keep doing what you're doing, man. It's really, really important.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for this invitation, and I enjoyed this conversation. Hopefully we can continue it at some point.
We are absolutely going to have you back and back again, and do want, if you have any leads whatsoever on people that are actually accruing biosamples for risk prediction for vaccine safety outcomes, it's unbelievably valuable to everyone to be able to do that. So rational vaccine screening, I'm 100% for it. All right, so thank you. So my friends and my followers, I want to tell you that was one of the most enjoyable interviews that I've had. Just the very fact that we could actually have a reasonable conversation with somebody who is pro-vaccine, who's taken the COVID-19 vaccine himself, and we hope nothing ever happens to anybody when that happens, but also has a clear vision and the activism background to actually take action and contact the people in play who can make a difference with what he realized. Obviously, I think Dr. Noorchashm hopes that he's wrong. That's obviously, he's a humanitarian. But what I tend not to do is I tend not to promote. I'm really bad at this. So if you're on YouTube, like and follow. And if you want to support Unbreaking Science, go to patreon.com/WWDNYK so that we can bring you the episodes like this, continue the conversation, and that kind of thing. And please, please, please share this video across all social media so that people can join in the conversation with their own doctors about this, and with their regulatory agencies, and with their administrators, if they're in the healthcare, their employers, and they can talk to their legislators, all of it. We have to have these kinds of conversations. Dr. James Lyons-Weiler, really happy with how this went today. Signing out. Talk to you guys later.